Hey guys, Michal Hucko here and welcome to another lecture of our REST API course. In this lecture, we're gonna start with absolute basics. If you are somehow experienced programmer and you already know how internet works, even though you have some experience, I would recommend you to watch this video. Excuse me if I'm gonna talk about some very easy stuff, but I'm not expecting any experience from the viewers who are watching these videos. So in this video, we're gonna talk about how internet works. Most of you are using internet daily and you are just using it through your smartphones, maybe using Wi-Fi and 5G or 4G depending on your operator and the state where you're located. So how does it really work? Internet is nothing else just a bunch of wires across the globe connected through switches and routers. In order to have a functionable internet, there had to be some consensus between the sites who are using it. Because internet is nothing else just electricity signal going through the wires between 2 points, right? In order to make this network working, people established a model which is called a 7-layer OSI model on top of these networking cables, right? In this video, we're gonna just slightly touch this 7-layer OSI model. When I was at the university, I have really a dedicated subject about this 7-layer OSI model, and there is a lot to talk about this 7-layer OSI model. So just briefly, when you are using your internet browser accessing some website, let's say google.com, the only thing which you are using is this search bar maybe at the top where you are writing some domain name .something, right? But behind the scenes, you really need to know a location where the server resides. In reality, what is happening behind the scenes, you are talking with the server, which is then providing you back the web page, which is then visualized in your web browser. But how do you get the address of the web page? Firstly, what is the address? When we are talking about the internet and the 7-layer OSI model, depending on which layer you reside, there is a different specification of the address of the server with which you are communicating. In this lecture, we're gonna talk about IP addresses. IP address is the way how we characterize the server which we are talking to through the internet. When we are talking about IP addresses, the protocol specifying the IP addresses resides at the 3rd layer of the OSI model, the networking layer. Now, the layer in the OSI model are closely connected with each other. So when you are using a layer, let's say 4, with all the protocols and standards, you are also using all the layers and protocols applied on the layers underneath, right? So when we are on the third layer, we are assuming that the data link layer, so the 2nd layer below, and the next layer below the physical layer is set up properly. Now the IP address itself has currently 2 forms, the IPv6 and IPv4. Today we're gonna talk about IP address of type IPv4. The IPv4 address consists of 4 numbers separated with dots. Maybe you have seen it somewhere. Each of these numbers is from 0 up to 255. So as you can imagine, with combining all these numbers from 0 to 255 on each position, we can have a lot of combinations for IP addresses, which we can assign them to the servers. However, nowadays, servers are added to the network daily. And there is a bunch of servers all around the world, and there will be a lot of them. So right now we have problem. There is not enough IP addresses in the format of IPv4. Because of this, people came up with a solution which is IPv6, which is slightly different type of IP address specification. This type allows you to create much more addresses with much bigger numbers on different positions, and there are much more positions. But today and in this tutorial, we're gonna talk mostly about IPv4 specification because most of the servers are using it and the humankind is slowly transitioning itself to the IPv6. So maybe in the later tutorials, I will talk more about the IPv6. Okay, so let's go to the practical part. How does our web browser knows the IP address of the server with which it should communicate? So right now I am in my Google Chrome. Before I start, I highly recommend you to install the Google Chrome. I really like this web browser and I think it's one of the best browsers out there. The performance is well and it has a lot of great built-in tools which we're gonna use, okay? So in order to continue with me and try the examples on your own, please install, download and install Google Chrome. It's quite simple. You just go to googlechrome.com and you press install, download and then install the file which you already downloaded. For every platform is the same. Now I am in my Google Chrome and it out of the box opens the google.com. So what really happened when I go to the search bar and I write here google.com? So when I write it here again and I press enter, the same page is being loaded. But let's click on the search bar again 2 times. You will see here something very strange. I wrote there google.com, but suddenly there is something strange. There is https://www.google.com. So why it is translated like this? This is called a URL. URL is a term which we're gonna use mostly in this course, and it's good to remember what does it mean. URL stands for Uniform Resource Locator. And in general, URL is a convention which is used with web pages. And URL is specifying a resource, so some data, let's say in this case web page, which locates itself on this location. So that's the L in the name. Many times you will hear about URI. URI or URI is a specification Uniform Resource Identifier, which is a superset of URL. So every URL is in general an URI, okay? So don't be confused. Many times you will see in some web pages and tutorials people referring to this as a URL or URI. In general, it should be the same. Yeah, there are some differences, but because this is a course for beginners, we just need to know that URL is URI in general, but yeah, there are some differences. Just for interest, there is also something which is called URN. It's also a subset of a URI, and it is just specifying the resource by the name, okay? And you cannot change the name for a resource. In URL, the resource, which is the URL pointing to, can change over time. That's the reason why it's connected with the web applications, because web applications get updated and this kind of stuff happening behind the scenes. Okay, so what is this URL? It is important to understand what URL stands for. So the first part of the URL is this HTTPS column / part, okay? Let's imagine there is no column / part. This is just the delimiter between the next part, okay? What is this HTTPS? This HTTPS is a protocol, okay? And protocol, if you remember from the beginning of the video, is connected with the 7-layer OC model. So as I was talking about IP addresses and the third layer, the HTTPS is a protocol connected with the top, with the absolute toppest layer, the application layer, so the 7th layer. And the HTTPS is a protocol which helps us to get the websites from the servers, so the way how we are doing it daily. HTTPS stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol, and it's one of the most popular protocols out there. Of course, there are also different protocols like FTP or SMTP for mails, but in this tutorial, we will be mostly talking about HTTP protocol. So HTTP protocol, 7th layer of protocol, right? It's part of the URL before the delimiter of column and //. But wait, Michal, there is HTTPS, and you were talking about HTTP. HTTPS stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol Secure, okay? And HTTPS is very similar to HTTP protocol with one difference. The communication between the server and the client, in this case your browser, is encrypted. It means like if there is a man in the middle who is listening to your communication between the server and the client, which can be anyone who can connect to your network, just grab the cable and put it into his PC, is unable to get the information from the message because this is being encrypted. So when you will be out there on the website and the website will be asking you for some private information or for some credit card numbers, one thing which you should make sure is the HTTPS is here in the URL. It means that the communication will be encrypted and this page can be somehow reliable. But yeah, there are also other ways how the hackers can attack you. So HTTPS is not always secure, but yeah, it's one of the first things you should check when you are writing down your card number into some strange form. Okay. So now let's go behind the delimiter. So this is delimiter. It's delimiter. It's mostly used. Now we have here important part, www. Many people are ignoring this and don't understand what does it mean. It's a subdomain, okay? So I will come back to the subdomain. Then we have here Google. Google is a domain name. So it's something which you can buy. And This Google and the Google string is then referring somehow to your server. I will explain later how. And then we have here this .com. This is a top-level domain. And top-level domain can be different. In this case, it's a three-letter top-level domain. Depending on your state where you are, there is a convention that the top-level domain can consist of 2 letters. For example, in Europe, where I live, the country where I'm from, the Slovakia has .sk, or if you are from Germany, it's .de, right? But in this case, if you are like English-speaking country, there is a convention to use like .com in US, for example, okay? So, and this whole thing, so this is a domain name, the Google, and .com is a top-level domain, and here we have a subdomain. It's important to add the subdomain. And the www is not the only subdomain you will encounter on the internet. For example, if you go to your Gmail, I won't go now to the Gmail because I have there some private mails. And if you click on the URL at the top, you will see that there is no www, and instead there is a mail.google.com. Yeah, so do it, go to your Gmail and double click on the top search bar. You will see no www, right? So that's a subdomain, and www is just very popular subdomain saying like there is some public content, but yeah, nowadays it can mean anything, right? It doesn't have to be public. Yeah, so just remember it's a subdomain. The first part, subdomain, domain name, and top level domain. Fine, so this is the URL, and we are basically writing down the URL. And although when I was writing at the beginning the string, I didn't put there the HTTPS double column / and www.google.com. I just put there google.com. The browser itself is so intelligent that it already knows that I want to go to www with the HTTPS protocol, this kind of stuff, okay? So those are the modern browsers and they are doing it for you, but basically you are accessing it through the whole string as this. So just keep it in head. We will come back to the URLs later because this is not the only part of the URL. There are some additional parts which we're going to talk later about. So now let's go back to the IP addresses. Where is the IP address, Michal? I'm writing here just this kind of string and no IP address. So how is possible that I'm able to communicate with the server? You said you can only communicate with the server when you know the IP address. Okay, so what is happening behind the scenes? Behind the scenes, every time you put here something and press enter, a request is being triggered from your client to the server through the internet. Okay, and in order to access the server, you need the IP address. And in order to get the IP address, your request URL needs to be resolved into the IP address. And this resolution is happening on something which is called the DNS server. DNS stands for domain name server. Okay? And the DNS server resides somewhere in the network. Okay? And it's provided to you by your ISP, Internet Service Provider, which you are paying the money, monthly. I hope so, right? And this server receives your request from www.google.com and it looks for the IP address in its records, okay? So this DNS server has its own records and it will find out that this google.com has this IP address and it will send back the IP address of the Google to you. And then you can send the request back to the correct server using the IP address instead of the URL, okay? So although you are just pressing the enter once and you see immediately the result, this web page, behind the scenes, many times, 2 requests are happening. To the DNS, the DNS will return back the IP address, and then you are using this IP address to access the Google server. In my Google, now I'm going to demonstrate what is happening behind the scenes. Google has one very nice feature. You can see all the requests which are happening behind the scenes whenever you are triggering something. In order to do this, you need to access the console of the Google Chrome. So in order to do that, you right-click here and you click on the Inspect button here. This will open a stuff which you can resize, right? If you have it like small like this, you can make it bigger. On the left side, you see the result, which is the server sending to you. This result is in the HTML form. In this tutorial, we ain't gonna talk about HTML because REST APIs are mostly connected with something else, which we're gonna talk about later. But in general, this HTML is being sending to you from a server. HTML is a format of document. And although it's visual in your browser, it's just because the browser can visualize it. In reality, the HTML looks like this. You have it here. This is the HTML of the site you can see here. And every element, you can click here and click on some element, has its own HTML tag, like this, specified with bunch of strange words and a lot of standards, which we ain't gonna talk today because I don't like HTML. I'm not a front-end guy. I'm more of a backend guy, DevOps guy. So we're gonna talk about backend in this tutorial. Okay, back to the requests. So this is the elements part, and there are a bunch of other cards which we maybe gonna through later. But the important part which you want to look at is the network part. This network part is tracing every request your browser is sending to any server during the time. So these are some historical requests which we gonna ignore right now. The thing which we're gonna do, we click again in the google.com and we press enter. And in this way, you will see how many requests are being triggered one after another. You can see how long they take, like a couple of milliseconds. But the request which we are interested in mostly is the www.google.com. It's the URL, right? If you click on the request, you will see a definition of this request. In the request URL, we have the whole URL which I was talking about. And then what we have here is this remote address. This is the IP address of the server which we communicate with. If you look at the IP address, it consists of two parts separated by column again. Let's ignore the last part. We're going to talk about this part later. It's called the port. Right now, the important part is the IP address. It's an IPv4 IP address. It consists of 4 numbers separated by dots, as I said at the beginning, right? So 172.217.23.196. So this is the address of the Google server which I'm communicating with. Google has many servers, and it's very likely that when you run your request, you will have here a different IP address. But maybe you will have the same if you are from Europe and somewhere close to me. Okay, so as you can see, there are also other requests which are happening behind the scenes, but for now we can ignore them. Okay, right? Why is it like that? Because if you click here, the preview will show you what answer from the server is being, or the response from the server is being sent to you. And you can see this is the response. And if you look closely, you see that the Google logo, for example, is missing. Why? Because there is other service which is providing the logo somewhere here. One of these requests is like requesting the logo, how it looks like. And then your browser behind the scenes is just connecting the responses from the server and it's putting them into this beautiful HTML, which you can see in your web browser. Okay? Although this part had a lot of, technical details. And if you are lost, don't worry. Continue with this course, and slowly it will make more sense to you. Why I'm doing this? Because as we will go to the more complicated topics, I would rather explain you basics first and then go for different and more complicated ones. Because I see many times that people have experience with something complicated and there is a lack of the basic knowledge with the basic technology which is happening behind the scenes. So in this lecture we were talking about 7-layer OSI model, which is the modern internet. That's how the internet works. I was talking about the layer 3, the networking layer where the IP resides. IP is a specification of the address where the server resides. There are 2 types of IPs, IPv4 and IPv6. Today we were talking about IPv4, which consists of 4 numbers separated by dots, 0 to 255, okay, numbers in between these dots. And I was talking about how the URL, what is the URL, differences between URL, and how the URL is being resolved through the DNS behind the scenes, which is provided by ISP behind the scenes. I was showing you how to use Google Chrome to track the network requests which are happening behind the scenes whenever you are pressing enter in the search bar. And I showed you how the www.com, the google.com, was resolved into the IP address of a Google server, which is somewhere behind the scenes communicating with me. Thank you very much for watching. I hope I will see you in the next video.